Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with Part 5, an examination of Virgil's 6th book of the Aeneid, from an exposition of the mysteries or religious dogmas and customs of the ancient Egyptians, Pythagoreans and Druids. Also an inquiry into the origin, history and purport of Freemasonry, by John Fellows, A.M. Chapter 3. An examination of Virgil's 6th book of the Aeneid, in which it is shown that the allegorical descent of Aeneas into hell is no other than an enigmatical representation of his initiation into the mysteries. We've seen in general how fond and tenacious ancient paganism was of this extraordinary rite, as of an institution supremely useful both to society and religion. But this will be seen more fully in what I now proceed to lay before the reader. An examination of two celebrated pieces of antiquity, the famous 6th book of Virgil's Aeneid and the Metamorphosis of Apuleius, the first of which will show us of what use the mysteries were esteemed to society, and the second of what use to religion. An inquiry into Aeneas's adventure to the shades will have this farther advantage: the instructing us in the shows and representations of the mysteries, a part of their history, which the form of this discourse upon them hath not yet enabled us to give, so that nothing will be now wanting to a perfect knowledge of this most extraordinary and important institution. For the descent of Virgil's hero into the infernal regions, I presume, was no other than a figurative description of an initiation, and particularly a very exact picture of the spectacles in the Eleusinian mysteries, where everything was done in show and machinery, and where a representation of the history of Ceres afforded opportunity of bringing in the scenes of heaven, hell, Elysium, purgatory, and whatever related to the future state of men and heroes. As the Aeneid is in the style of ancient legislation, it would be hard to think that so great a master in his art should overlook a doctrine which, we have shown, was the foundation and support of ancient politics, namely, a future state of rewards and punishments. Accordingly, he hath given us a complete system of it in imitation of his models, which were Plato's vision of Eros and Tully's dream of Scipio. Again, as the lawgiver took care to support this doctrine by a very extraordinary institution, and to commemorate it by a rite which had all the allurement of spectacle, and afforded matter for the utmost embellishments of poetry, we cannot but confess a description of such a scene would add largely to the grace and elegance of his work, and must conclude he would be invited to attempt it. Accordingly, he hath done this likewise in the allegorical descent of Aeneas into hell, which is no other than an enigmatical representation of his initiation into the mysteries. Virgil was to represent a perfect lawgiver in the person of Aeneas. Now, initiation into the mysteries was what sanctified his character and ennobled his function. Hence we find all the ancient heroes and lawgivers were in fact initiated. Another reason for the hero's initiation was the important instructions he received in matters that concerned his office. A third reason for his initiation was the custom of seeking support and inspiration from the god who presided in the mysteries. A fourth reason for his initiation was the circumstance in which the poet has placed him, unsettled in his affairs and anxious about his future fortune. Now, amongst the uses of initiation, the advice and direction of the oracle was not the least, and an oracular bureau was so necessary an appendix to some of the mysteries, as particularly the Samothracian, that Plutarch, speaking of Lysander's initiation there, expresses it by a word that signifies consulting the oracle. On this account, Jason, Orpheus, Hercules, Castor, and, as Macrobius says, Tarquinius Priscus, were every one of them initiated into those mysteries. All this the poet seems clearly to have intimated in the speech of Anchises to his son: "Carry with you to Italy the choicest of the youths, the stoutest hearts. In Latium you have to subdue a hardy race, rugged in manners. But first, my son, visit Pluto's infernal mansions, and in quest of an interview with me, cross the deep floods of Avernus." A fifth reason was the conforming to the old popular tradition, which said that several other heroes of the Trojan times, such as Agamemnon and Ulysses, had been initiated. A sixth and principal was that Augustus, who was shadowed in the person of Aeneas, had been initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries. While the mysteries were confined to Egypt, their native country, and while the Grecian lawgivers went thither to be initiated as a kind of designation to their office, The ceremony would be naturally described in terms highly allegorical. This was in part owing to the genius of the Egyptian manners, in part to the humor of travelers, but most of all to the policy of lawgivers, who, returning home to civilize a barbarous people by laws and arts, found it useful and necessary in order to support their own characters and to establish the fundamental principle of a future state, to represent that initiation, in which they saw the state of departed mortals in machinery as an actual descent into hell. This way of speaking was used by Orpheus, Bacchus, and others, and continued even after the mysteries were introduced into Greece, as appears by the fables of Hercules, Castor, Pollux, and Theseus's descent into hell. But the allegory was generally so circumstanced as to discover the truth concealed under it. So Orpheus is said to go to hell by the power of his harp, that is, in quality of lawgiver, the harp being the known symbol of his laws by which he humanized a rude and barbarous people. So again, in the lives of Hercules and Bacchus, we have the true history and the fable founded on it, blended and recorded together. For we are told that they were in fact initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries, and that it was just before their descent into hell as an aid and security in that desperate undertaking, which in plain speech was no more than that they could not safely see the shows till they had been initiated. The same may be said of what is told us of Theseus's adventure. Near Eleusis there was a well called Callichorus, and adjoining to that a stone on which, as the tradition went, Ceres sat down sad and weary on her coming to Eleusis. Hence the stone was named Aguilastus, the melancholy stone, on which account it was deemed unlawful for the initiated to sit thereon. For Ceres, says Clemens, wandering about in search of her daughter Proserpine when she came to Eleusis, grew weary and sat down melancholy on the side of a well. So that to this very day it is unlawful for the initiated to sit down there, lest they who are now become perfect should seem to imitate her in her desolate condition. Now let us see what they tell us concerning Theseus's descent into hell. There is also a stone, says the scholiast on Aristophanes, called by the Athenians Agilastus, on which they say Theseus sat when he was meditating his descent into hell. Hence the stone had its name, or perhaps because Ceres sat there weeping when she sought Proserpine. All this seems plainly to intimate that the descent of Theseus was his entrance into the Eleusinian mysteries, which entrance, as we shall see hereafter, was a fraudulent intrusion. Both Euripides and Aristophanes seem to confirm our interpretation of these descents into hell. Euripides, in his Hercules Furens, brings the hero, just come from hell, to succor his family and destroy the tyrant Lycus. Juno, in revenge, persecutes him with the Furies, and he, in his transport, kills his wife and children, whom he mistakes for his enemies. When he comes to himself, he is comforted by his friend Theseus, who would excuse his excesses by the criminal examples of the gods, a consideration which, as I have observed above, greatly encouraged the people in their irregularities, and was therefore obviated in the mysteries by the detection of the vulgar errors of polytheism. Now Euripides seems plainly enough to have told us what he thought of the fabulous descents into hell by making Hercules reply, like one just come from the celebration of the mysteries and entrusted with the apparitor. The examples, says he, which you bring of the gods are nothing to the purpose. I cannot think them guilty of the crimes imputed to them. I cannot apprehend how one God can be the sovereign of another God. A God who is truly so stands in need of no one. Reject we then these idle fables which the poets teach concerning them, a secret which we must suppose Theseus had not yet learnt. The comic poet, in his Frogs, tells us as plainly what he too understood to be the ancient hero's descent into hell, by the equipage which he gives to Bacchus when he brings him in, inquiring the way of Hercules. It was the custom at the celebration of the Eleusinian mysteries, as we are told by the scholiast on the place, to have what was wanted in those rites carried upon asses. Hence the proverb, assinus portat mysteria. Accordingly, the poet introduces Bacchus, followed by his buffoon servant Xanthias, bearing a bundle in like manner and riding on an ass. Unless the meaning of this should be mistaken, Xanthias, on Hercules is telling Bacchus that the inhabitants of Elysium were initiated, puts in and says, "And I am the ass carrying mysteries." This was so broad a hint that it seems to have awakened the old scholiast, who, when he comes to that place where the chorus of the initiated appears, tells us, We are not to understand this scene as really lying in the Elysian fields, but in the Eleusinian mysteries. The resemblance between the practices of Masonry and those of the ancient mysteries is too striking not to be noticed. Here we have the chorus of the initiated. In Masonry, we observe the apprentices, the fellow crafts, and the master mason's chorus or song, that is, songs adapted to each degree. Here then, as was the case in many other of the ancient fables, the pomp of expression betrayed willing posterity into the marvelous. But why need we wonder at this in the genius of more ancient times, which delighted to tell the commonest things in a highly figurative manner, when a writer of so late an age as Apuleius, either in imitation of antiquity or perhaps in compliance to the received phraseology of the mysteries, describes his initiation in the same manner? I approached to the confines of death, and having trod on the threshold of Proserpine, I returned from it, being carried through all the elements. At midnight I saw the sun shining with a splendid light, and I manifestly drew near to the gods beneath and the gods above, and proximately adored them. Aeneas could not have described his night's journey to his companions after he had been let out of the ivory gate in properer terms, had it been indeed to be understood as a journey into hell. Thus we see Virgil was obliged to have his hero initiated, and that he had the authority of fabulous antiquity to call his initiation a descent into hell, and surely he made use of his advantages with great judgment, for such a fiction animates the relation which, delivered out of allegory, had been too cold and flat for epic poetry. Had an old poem under the name of Orpheus, entitled A Descent into Hell, been now extant, it would perhaps have shown us that no more was meant than Orpheus's initiation, and that the idea of this sixth book was taken from thence. But further, it was customary for the poets of the Augustan age to exercise themselves on the subject of the mysteries, as appears from Cicero, who desires Atticus, then at Athens, and initiated, to send to Chilius, a poet of eminence, an account of the Eleusinian mysteries, in order, as it would seem, to insert into some poem he was then writing. Thus it appears that both the ancient and modern poets afforded Virgil a pattern for this famous episode. Even Servius saw thus far into Virgil's design as to say that many things were delivered according to the profound learning of the Egyptian theology. And we have shown that the doctrines taught in the mysteries were invented by that people. But though I say this was our poet's general design, I would not be supposed to think he followed no other guides. Several of the circumstances are borrowed from Homer, and several of the philosophic notions from Plato, some of which will be taken notice of in their place. The great manager in this affair is the Sibyl, and as a virgin, she sustains two principal and distinct parts, that of the inspired priestess to pronounce the oracle, and that of Hierophant to conduct the initiated through the whole celebration. This remark can apply only to the show and representations of the lesser mysteries, at the conclusion of which the office of the female Hierophant ends, if we can judge by the duty imposed upon the Sibyl by Virgil, as will appear further on. For as we have observed, the initiated had a guide or conductor called Hierophantes, Mystagogos, indifferently of either sex, who was to instruct him in the preparatory ceremonies and lead him through and explain to him all the shows and representations of the mysteries. Hence, Virgil calls the Sibyl Magna Sacerdos, and Doctor comes, words of equivalent signification. And as the female mystagogue, as well as the male, was devoted to a single life, so was the Cumean Sibyl, whom he calls Casta Sibylla. Another reason why a priestess is given to conduct him is because Proserpine presides in this whole affair, and the name of the priestess in the Eleusinian mysteries shows that she properly belonged to Proserpine, though she was called the priestess of Ceres. The ancients, says Porphyrius, called the priestesses of Ceres Melissae, bees, as being the ministers or hierophants of the subterraneous goddess, and Proserpine herself, Melitodes. It was for this reason that these female hierophants were called Melissae, as is well observed by the scholiast on Pindar in Pythian, the bee being among the ancients the symbol of chastity. The bee, or rather beehive, among the Masonic symbols, is considered an emblem of industry, for which there is probably some authority in antiquity. The first instruction the priestess gives Aeneas is to search for the golden bough sacred to Proserpine. Under this branch is concealed the wreath of myrtle, with which the initiated were crowned at the celebration of the mysteries. The golden bough is said to be sacred to Proserpine, and so we are told was the myrtle. Proserpine only is mentioned all the way, partly because the initiation is described as an actual descent into hell, but principally because when the rites of the mysteries were performed, Ceres and Proserpine were equally invoked. But when the shows were represented, then Proserpine alone presided. Now this book is a representation of the shows of the mysteries. The quality of this golden bough with its lento vimen admirably describes the tender branches of myrtle. But the reader may ask, why is this myrtle branch represented to be of gold? Not merely for the sake of the marvelous, he may be assured. A golden bough was literally part of the sacred equipage in the shows of the mysteries. For the branch, which was sometimes unrealized into a crown and worn on the head, was at other times carried in the hand. Clemens Alexandrinus tells us from Dionysius Thrax, the grammarian, that it was an Egyptian custom to hold a branch in the act of adoration. And of what kind these branches were, Apuleius tells us in his description of a procession of the initiated in the mysteries of Isis. A third advanced bearing a palm branch of thin gilt leaves, and also the mercurial caduceus. The golden branch then and the caduceus were related, and accordingly Virgil makes the former do the usual office of the latter, in affording a free passage into the regions of the dead. Again, Apuleius, describing the fifth person in the procession, says, "A fifth bearing a golden van full of golden boughs." So that a golden bough, we see, was an important implement and of a very complicated intention in the shows of the mysteries. Aeneas, having now possessed himself of the golden bough, a passport as necessary to his descent as a myrtle crown to initiation. He is then led to the opening of the descent. Here stood a cave profound and hideous, with a wide yawning mouth, stony, fenced by a black lake and gloomy woods. And his reception is thus described. The ground beneath their feet began to rumble, the mountain tops to quake, and dogs were seen to howl through the shade of the woods at the approach of the goddess. How similar is all this to the fine description of the poet Claudian, where, professedly and without disguise, he speaks of the tremendous entry into these mystic rites. Now I see the shrines shake upon their tottering bases, and lightnings, announcing the deity's approach, shed a vivid glare around. Now a loud warring is heard from the depths of the earth, and the Cecropian temple re-echoes, and Eleusis raises her holy torches. The snakes of Triptolemus hiss, and lift their scaly necks, rubbed by their curved yokes. So afar, the threefold Hecate bursts forth. Both these descriptions agree exactly with the relations of the ancient Greek writers on this subject. Dion Chrysostom, speaking of initiation into the mysteries, gives us this general idea of it. Just so it is, as when one leads a Greek or barbarian to be initiated in a certain mystic dome, excelling in beauty and magnificence, where he sees many mystic sights and hears in the same manner a multitude of voices, where darkness and light alternately affect his senses, and 1,000 other uncommon things present themselves before him. The ritual of initiation was read aloud, and hymns were sung in honor of Ceres. Soon after, a hollow sound was heard, and the earth seemed to groan beneath our feet. We heard thunder, and perceived by the glare of the lightning phantoms and spectres wandering in darkness and filling the holy places with howlings that chilled us with terror and groans that rent our hearts. This happy moment, de l'autopsis, was introduced, says Dupuis, by frightful scenes, by alternate fear and joy, by light and darkness, by the glimmerings of light, by the terrible noise of thunder which was imitated, and by the apparitions of spectres, of magical illusions which struck the eyes and ears all at once. Seymour's Epicurean. De Paul, in his philosophical dissertation on the Egyptian and Chinese, observes, "Were it true, as some have pretended, that certain mysteries were celebrated in apartments of the labyrinth, it would not have been difficult to produce noise there as violent as thunder. Pliny assures us that the repercussion of the air in that edifice, merely on opening the doors, which probably acting as suckers caused others to shut. According to the common report, thunder was imitated in Greece by rolling stones in vessels of copper. The initiated were to be terrified, and this was done effectually in the mysteries of Mithra. If Virgil copied solely from initiations in the Eleusinian mysteries, the temples of Ceres would seem to have been constructed on a plan similar to that of the Egyptian labyrinth. For in the 6th book of the Aeneid, verse 126, are the following lines. Now, with a furious blast, the 100 doors ope of themselves, a rushing whirlwind roars within the cave, and Sibylla's voice restores. Similar delusions are practiced in Royal Arch Masonry, where thunder is imitated by rolling cannonballs, etc. The poet next relates the fanatic agitation of the mystagogue on this occasion. Procul, O procul, este, profane, etc. Hence, far hence, O ye profane, exclaims the prophetess, and begone from all the grove. This said, she furiously plunged into the open cave. When about to open a chapter of Royal Archmasons, the high priest says, if there be any person present who is not a Royal Archmason, he is requested to retire. Bernard. So again, Claudian, where he counterfeits in his own person the raptures and astonishment of the initiated, and throws himself, as it were, like the Sibyl in the middle of the scene. Away, ye profane! Now fury has expelled human feelings from my breast. The affectation of fury or madness, as we are told by Strabo, Book 10, was an inseparable circumstance of the mysteries. The procul, o proculeste, profani of the Sibyl, is a literal translation of the formula used by the mystagogue at the opening of the mysteries, ekas este, bebeloi. But now the poet, intending to accompany his hero through all the mysterious rites of his initiation and conscious of the imputed impiety in bringing them out to open day, stops short in his narration and breaks out into this solemn apology. Di quibus in imperium est animarum, etc. Ye gods, to whom the empire of ghosts belongs, and ye silent shades and chaos and phlegethon, places where silence reigns around in the realms of night, permit me to utter the secrets I have heard. May I have your divine permission to disclose things buried in deep earth and darkness. Claudian, who, as we have observed, professes openly to treat of the Eleusinian mysteries at a time when they were in little veneration, yet, in compliance to old custom, excuses his undertaking in the same manner. Di quibus in numerum, etc. Had the revealing of the mysteries been as penal at Rome as it was in Greece, Virgil had never ventured on this part of his poem. But yet it was esteemed impious. He therefore does it covertly and makes this apology to such as saw into his meaning. The hero and his guide now enter on their journey. They advanced under the solitary night through the shade and through the desolate halls and empty realms of Pluto, their progress resembling a journey in woods by the precarious glimmering moon under a faint malignant light, when Jupiter hath wrapped up the heavens in shade, and sable night hath stripped objects of colour. This description will receive much light from a passage in Lucian's dialogue of the Tyrant. As a company made up of every condition of life are voyaging together to the other world, Maecilius breaks out and says, "Bless us, how dark it is! Where is the fair Megillus? Who can tell in this situation whether Simice or Phryna be the handsomer? Everything is alike and of the same colour. There is no room for rivalling of beauties. My old cloak, which but now presented to your eyes so irregular a figure, is become as honourable a garb as His Majesty's purple. They are indeed both vanished and retired together under the same cover." The original has a peculiar elegance, hapan gar ampho, etc. Alludes to the ancient Greek notions concerning the first matter, which they called aphanes, invisible as being without the qualities of form and colour. The investing matter with these qualities was the production of bodies, the taphaenomena. Their dissolution, a return to a state of invisibility, aisophanes chore ta dialuomena, as the pretended Mercurius Trismegistus has it, chapter 11. Matter in this state of invisibility was by the earlier Greeks called Hades. Afterwards the state itself was so called, and at length it came to signify the abode of departed spirits. Hence some of the Orphic odes which were sung in the mysteries bore the title of Ais ad Katabasis, a descent into the regions of the dead, a little equivalent to Teletea and Hieros Logos. But my friend, the cynic, where are you? Give me your hand. You are initiated in the Eleusinian mysteries. Tell me now, do you not think this very like the blind march they make there? Oh, extremely, and see, here comes one of the Furies, as I guess by her equipage, her torch, and her terrible looks. The Sibyl, on their approach to the mouth of the cave, had advised Aeneas to call up all his courage as being to undergo the severest trials. Do you, Aeneas, boldly march forward and snatch your sword from its sheath. Now is the time for fortitude, now for firmness of resolution. These trials were of two sorts, the encountering real labors and difficulties, and the being exposed to imaginary and false terrors. This latter was submitted to by all the initiated in general. The other was reserved for chiefs and leaders, on which account Virgil describes them both in their order, as they were both to be undergone by his hero. The first in these words, before the very courts and in the opening jaws of hell, grief and tormenting cares have fixed their couches, and pale diseases, repining age, fear and famine, forms terrible to view, terribil visu forme, and death and toil, then sleep that is akin to death, and criminal joys of the mind. And in the opposite threshold, murderous war, the iron bedchambers of the Furies, and frantic discord. To understand the force of this description, it will be necessary to transcribe the account the ancients have left us of the probationary trials in the mysteries of Mithras, whose participation was more particularly aspired to by chiefs and leaders of armies, whence those initiated were commonly called the soldiers of Mithras. No one, says Nonnus, could be initiated into these mysteries till he had passed gradually through the probationary labors by which he was to acquire a certain apathy and sanctity. There were 80 degrees of these labors, from less to greater, and when the aspirant has gone through them all, he is initiated. These labors are to pass through fire, to endure cold, hunger and thirst, to undergo much journeying, and in a word, every toil of this nature. They exercised the candidates, says Dupuis in his Recherches sur les initiations, many days. To cross by swimming a large extent of water, they threw them into it, and it was with great difficulty that they extricated themselves. They applied a sword and fire to their bodies. They made them pass over flames. The aspirants were often in considerable danger, and Pythagoras, we are told, nearly lost his life in the trials. In tracing the early connections of spectacles with the ceremonies of religion, Voltaire says, "The truly grand tragedies, the imposing and terrible representations, were the sacred mysteries, which were celebrated in the greatest temples in the world, in presence of the initiated only. It was there that the habits, the decorations, the machinery were proper to the subject, and the subject was the present and future life." Volney shows the origin of these ceremonies. The Egyptians, says Porphyry, employ every year a talisman in remembrance of the world. At the summer solstice they mark their houses, flocks and trees with red, supposing that on that day the whole world had been set on fire. It was also at the same period that they celebrated the Pyrrhic or fire dance. And this illustrates the origin of purification by fire and water, for having denominated the Tropic of Cancer gate of heaven and of heat, or celestial fire, and that of Capricorn gate of deluge or of water, it was imagined that the spirits or souls who passed through these gates in their way to and from heaven were scorched or bathed. Hence the baptism of Mithra and the passage through the flames, observed throughout the East long before Moses. Ruins, page 238. Ancient Masonry has slightly imitated these trials, particularly in the third and royal arch degrees. The Druids who established it were perhaps fearful that by carrying the joke too far, their practices might come to the knowledge of the government, which would probably have led to the destruction of the order. For founders, whose professed object was merely to teach the mechanical art of Masonry, to be engaged in the performance of such extravagances as were practiced in the ancient mysteries would certainly have alarmed even the initiated themselves, a great portion of whom, who were carried no farther than the third degree, doubtless retained their attachment to the Christian religion. They knew not what was meant by the ceremonies. They were pleased, however, with the shows. But the inventors of modern degrees of the order, without any regard to religion, keeping, however, for the most part within the pale of Christianity, have indulged their imaginations to an unbounded extent. They could have been influenced by no other motives than the pleasure of exercising their wit in experiments upon human credulity. The following specimens will show that the ancient models have served as the groundwork upon which the new superstructure has been reared, which, by the by, already extends 50 stories above the old fabric. In the degree called Chevalier de l'Orient, or Knight of the East, the master says to the junior general, "Cause Zerubbabel to undergo the 70 trials, which I reduced to 3, namely, first that of the body, second that of his courage, third that of his mind, after which perhaps he may merit the favor which he demands." Bernard. The following is taken from the Abbé Baruel, but whose book, being replete with falsehoods against Masonry, renders the account justly entitled to suspicion. It relates to initiations in the degree of Knight of Kadosh, or as he says, the regenerated man. Adepts have told me that no physical art is spared, that there is no machinery, grottos, thrones, etc., which are not employed to try the constancy of the candidate. We are told by Mr. Montjoy that the Duke of Orleans was obliged to ascend and then throw himself off a ladder. A deep cave, or rather precipice, whence a narrow tower rises to the summit of the lodge, having no avenue to it but by subterranean passages, was next traversed. Replete with horrors is the place where the candidate is abandoned to himself, tied hand and foot. In this situation, he finds himself raised from the ground by machines making the most frightful noise. He slowly ascends this dark vault and then suddenly falls, as if he were not supported by anything. Thus, mounting and falling alternately, he must carefully avoid showing any sign of fear. Perhaps on account of the high rank of the Duke of Orleans, he was thought entitled to greater perils and trials than common men. Bernard gives this degree, and although a ladder is required to be ascended, and the candidate is prohibited to return the same way, yet no such hazards as here related are spoken of. The description of the ceremonies in the degree of Knights of the White Eagle or Pelican, as reported to Carlyle, exceeds in terrors and awfulness even Baruel's account of those in the Knight of Kadosh. It must have been got up by persons intimately acquainted with the practices of the Holy Inquisition, particularly in regard to auto da fe. I will give a short extract from it. Second point of reception. The apartment for the preparation and for this reception is made as terrifying as possible to resemble the torments of hell. It has 7 chandeliers with grey burning flambeaux whose mouths represent death's heads with crossbones. The walls are hung with tapestry painted with flames and figures of the damned. The door is opened by a brother appointed to guard it, to whom each gives the report of a perfect Mason and the password Emmanuel. The candidate is instructed to say, "I am one of the brothers who seek the word lost by the aid of the new law and the 3 columns of Masonry." At these words, the guard takes his sash and apron from him, saying these marks of decoration are not humble enough to qualify him to find it, and that he must pass through much more vigorous trials. He then covers him with a black cloth so that he can see nothing, telling him that he must be conducted to the darkest of places, from which the word must come forth triumphant, to the glory of Masonry, and that he must abandon all self-confidence. In this condition, he is conducted into an apartment in which there is a steep descent up and down which he is directed to travel, after which he is conducted to the door, and the black cloth is removed. Before him stand 3 figures dressed as devils. He is then ordered to parade the room 3 times in memory of the mysterious descent into the dark places, which lasted 3 days. He is then led to the door of the apartment, covered with the black cloth, and told that the horrors through which he has passed are as nothing in comparison with those through which he has to pass. Therefore he is cautioned to summon all his fortitude to meet the dreadful scene. After further maneuvering of this sort, the candidate is reported to the master by the deacon as a Knight of the Eagle who, after penetrating the deepest places, hopes to procure the lost word as the fruit of his research and to become a perfect Mason, etc. On turning to Bernard's description of this degree, I find he agrees in substance with Carlyle. He says, "On the hangings of the 3rd apartment must be represented in transparent paintings all the horrors which we attach to the idea of hell, such as human figures and monsters with convulsed muscles engulfed in flames, etc., etc. On each side of the door is a human skeleton with an arrow in his hand, etc. Virgil has made the sufferings in the other world preparatory to admission into Elysium, as related by Anchises to Aeneas, to correspond with the trials to which candidates were subjected in the mysteries. Bishop Warburton refers to that part of the poem which describes the nature and end of purgatory, but does not quote the passage. Anchises says, "Even when with the last beams of light their life is gone, yet not every ill, nor all corporeal stains are quite removed from the unhappy beings, and it is absolutely unavoidable that many misinformed habits, which have long grown up with the soul, should be strangely confirmed and riveted therein. Therefore are they afflicted with pains, and pay the penalties of their former ills. Some, hung on high, are spread out to whiten in the empty winds. In others the guilt not done away is washed out in a vast watery abyss or burned away in fire. We have each of us a demon from whom we suffer, till length of time after the fixed period is elapsed, hath done away the inherent stains, and hath left celestial reason pure from all irregular passions, and returned that spark of heavenly fire in its original purity and brightness, simple and unmixed. Then are we conveyed into Elysium, and we, who are the happy few, possess the fields of bliss." The second sort of trial were the imaginary terrors of the mysteries, and these Virgil describes next. And to distinguish them from the real labors preceding, he separates the two accounts by that fine circumstance of the tree of dreams which introduces the latter. In the midst a gloomy elm displays its boughs and aged arms, which seat vain dreams are said to haunt, and under every leaf they dwell. Besides, many monstrous spectres of various forms, in the gate, centaurs and double-formed Scyllas, Briareus with his 100 hands, and the enormous snake of Lerna, hissing dreadful, and Chimera armed with flames, Gorgons, Harpies, and the form of Gerion's three-bodied ghost. These terribilis visu formas are the same which Pletho, in the place quoted above, calls allocota tes morphes phasmata, as seen in the entrance of the mysteries, and which Celsus tells us were likewise presented in the Bacchic rites. But it is reasonable to suppose that though these things had the use here assigned to them, it was some circumstance in the recondite physiology of the East which preferred them to this station. We are to consider then this dark entrance into the mysteries as a representation of the chaos thus characterized. They advanced under the solitary night through the desolate halls and empty realms of Pluto. And amongst the several powers invoked by the poet at his entrance on this scene, chaos is one. Now a fragment of Berosus, preserved by George Syncellus, describes the ancient chaos according to the physiology of the Chaldeans in this manner. There was a time, they say, when all was water and darkness. And these gave birth and habitation to monstrous animals of mixed forms and species, for there were men with 2 wings, others with 4, and some again with double faces. Some had the horns of goats, some their legs, and some the legs of horses. Others had the hind parts of horses, and the fore parts of men, like the hippocentaurs. There were bulls with human heads, dogs with 4 bodies ending in fishes, horses with dogs' heads, and men and other creatures with the heads and bodies of horses, and with the tails of fishes. And a number of animals, whose bodies were a monstrous compound of the dissimilar parts of beasts of various kinds. Together with these were fishes, reptiles, serpents, and other creatures which, by a reciprocal translation of the parts to one another, became all portentously deformed, the pictures and representations of which were hung up in the temple of Belus. A woman ruled over the whole, whose name was Omoroka, in the Chaldee tongue Thalath, which signifies the sea, and in the course of connection the moon. This account seems to have been exactly copied in the mysteries, as appears from the description of the poet. The canine figures have a considerable station in this region of monsters, and he tells us, "And dogs were seen to howl through the shade of the woods," which Pletho explains in his Scholia on the magic oracles of Zoroaster. It is the custom, in the celebration of the mysteries, to present before many of the initiated phantasms of a canine figure and other monstrous shapes and appearances. The woman, whose name coincides with that of the moon, was the Hecate of the Greeks, who is invoked by Aeneas on this occasion, by mystic sounds invoking Hecate, powerful both in heaven and hell. Hence, terrifying visions were called Hecatea. the ancients called Hecate Diva Triformis. And Scaliger observes that the word Thalath, which Syncellus or Berosus says was equivalent to the moon, signifies Tria. And now we soon find the hero in a fright. Here Aeneas, disconcerted with sudden fear, grasps his sword and presents the naked point to each approaching shade. With these affections, the ancients represent the initiated as possessed on his first entrance into these holy rites. Entering now into the mystic dome, says Themistius, he is filled with horror and amazement. He is seized with solicitude and a total perplexity. He is unable to move a step forward, and at a loss to find the entrance to that road which is to lead him to the place he aspires to, till the prophet or conductor, laying open the vestibule of the temple, to the same purpose proclus. As in the most holy mysteries, before the scene of the mystic visions, there is a terror infused over the minds of the initiated, so, etc. The adventurers come now to the banks of Cocytus. Aeneas is surprised at the crowd of ghosts which hover round it and appear impatient for a passage. His guide tells him they are those who have not had the rites of sepulture performed to their manes, and so are doomed to wander up and down for 100 years before they be permitted to cross the river. We are not to think this old notion took its rise from the vulgar superstition. It was one of the wisest contrivances of ancient politics, and came originally from Egypt, the fountainhead of legislation. Those profound masters of wisdom, in projecting for the common good, found nothing would more contribute to the safety of their fellow citizens than the public and solemn interment of the dead, as without this provision, private murders might be easily and securely committed. They therefore introduced the custom of pompous funeral rites, and, as Herodotus and Diodorus tell us, were of all people the most circumstantially ceremonious in the observance of them. To secure these by the force of religion as well as civil custom, they taught that the deceased could not retire to a place of rest till they were performed. The notion spread so wide and fixed its roots so deep that the substance of the superstition remains, even to this day, in most civilized countries. By so effectual a method did the legislature gain its end, the security of the citizen. Mr. Bayle cries out, "What injustice is this? Was it the fault of these souls that their bodies were not interred?" But not knowing the origin of this opinion nor seeing its use, he ascribes that to the blindness of religion, which was the issue of wise policy. The next thing observable is the ferryman, Charon, and he, the learned well know, was a substantial Egyptian, and as an ingenious writer says, immerely existing in this world. Blackwell's Life of Homer. The case was plainly thus. The Egyptians, like the rest of mankind in their descriptions of the other world, used to copy from something they were well acquainted with in this. In their funeral rites, which, as we observed, was a matter of greater moment with them than with any other people, they used to carry their dead over the Nile and through the marsh of Acherusia, and there put them into subterraneous caverns. The ferrymen employed in this business being in their language called Charon. Now in their mysteries, the description of the passage into the other world was borrowed, as was natural, from the circumstances of their funeral rites. And it might be easily proved, if there were occasion, that they themselves transferred these realities into the mythos and not the Greeks, as later writers generally imagine. Aeneas, having crossed the river and come into the proper regions of the dead, the first apparition that occurs is the dog Cerberus. Huge Cerberus makes those realms resound with barking from his triple jaws, stretched at his enormous length in a den that fronts the gate. This is plainly one of the phantoms of the mysteries, which Pletho tells above was in the shape of a dog, Cunodatina. And in the fable of Hercules' descent into hell, which we have shown signified no more than his initiation into the mysteries, it is said to have been, amongst other things, for fetching up the dog Cerberus. The prophetess, to appease his rage, gives him a medicated cake, which casts him into a slumber, flings to him a soporific cake of honey and medicated grains, medicator fem gibus. In the mysteries of Trophonius, who was said to be nursed by Ceres, that is to derive his rights from the Eleusinian, the initiated carried the same sort of medicated cakes to appease the serpents he met with in his passage. Tertullian, who gives all mysteries to the devil and makes him the author of what is done there, mentions the offering up of these cakes, celebrat et penis oblationem. This in question was of poppy seed made up with honey, and so I understand medicatis frugibus here on the authority of the poet himself, who in the 4th book makes the priestess of Venus prepare the same treat for the dragon who guarded the Hesperian fruit. But without doubt, the images which the juice of poppy presents to the fancy was one reason why this drug had a place in the ceremonial of the shows. Not improbably, it was given to some at least of the initiated to aid the impression of those mystic visions which passed before them. This practice obtains in a modern degree of masonry denominated le petit architecte. A portion is given to the candidate which he is told is a part of the secret of Master Hiram, preserved ever since his assassination, which every faithful Mason may receive, but that it cannot remain in the body of one who is perjured. After the candidate has swallowed the dose, the master thus addresses him: "Brother, one thing you came here to learn is that you ought never to refuse to confess your faults. Obstinacy ought to be banished from the heart of every good Mason." For that something like this was done, that is, giving medicated drugs to the aspirants, we are informed by Plutarch, who speaks of a shrub called leucophilus, used in the celebration of the mysteries of Hecate, which drives men into a kind of frenzy and makes them confess all the wickedness they had done or intended. And confession was one necessary preparative for initiation. What were called the secret ceremonies of the gods, says Fontenelle, were without doubt the best artifices the priests could invent to keep people in the dark. And yet they could not so well hide the juggle, but that the cheat would be suspected by many persons. Therefore they contrived among themselves to establish certain mysteries which should engage those who were initiated into them to an inviolable secrecy. Those who were initiated also gave further security for their discretion, for they were obliged to make a confession to their priests of all the most private actions of their lives, so that by this means they became slaves to their priests, that their own secrets might be kept. It was upon this sort of confession that a Lacedaemonian who was going to be initiated into the mysteries of Samothrace spoke roundly thus to the priest: "If I have committed any crime, surely the gods are not ignorant of them." Another answered almost after the same manner: "Is it to you or to God we ought to confess our crimes?" "It is to God," says the priest. "Well then, retire thou," answered the Lacedaemonian, "and I will confess them to God." These Lacedaemonians were not very full of the spirit of devotion. The regions, according to Virgil's geography, are divided into 3 parts: Purgatory, Tartarus, and Elysium. The mysteries divided them in the same manner. So Plato, where he speaks of what was taught in the mysteries, talks of souls sticking fast in mire and filth, and remaining in darkness till a long series of years had purged and purified them. And Celsus in Origin says that the mysteries taught the doctrine of eternal punishments. Of all the 3 states, this of Tartarus only was eternal. There was indeed another in the ancient pagan theology which had the same relation to Elysium that Tartarus had to purgatory, the extreme of reward, as Tartarus of punishment. But then this state was not in the infernal regions, but in heaven. Neither was it the lot of common humanity, but reserved for heroes and demons, beings of an order superior to men such as Hercules, Bacchus, etc., who became gods on their admission into that state, where the eternity was in consequence of their deification. And here it is to our purpose to observe that the virtues and vices which stock these 3 divisions with inhabitants are such as more immediately affect society. A plain proof that the poet followed the views of the legislator, the institutor of the mysteries. Purgatory, the first division, is inhabited by Zeus, extravagant lovers and ambitious warriors, and in a word, by all those who had indulged the violence of the passions, which made them rather miserable than wicked. It is remarkable that amongst these we find one of the initiated, Polybetes, devoted to Ceres. This was agreeable to the public doctrine of the mysteries, which taught that initiation with virtue procured men great advantages over others in a future state, but that without virtue it was of no service. Of all these disorders the poet hath more distinctly marked out the misery of Zeus. Here keeps close to the mysteries, which not only forbade Zeus, but taught on what account it was criminal. That which is said in the mysteries, says Plato, concerning these matters of man's being placed in a certain watch or station which it is unlawful to fly from or forsake, is a profound doctrine and not easily fathomed. Hitherto all goes well. But what must we say to the poets putting newborn infants and men falsely condemned into his purgatory? For though the faith and inquisition of modern Rome send many of both sorts into a place of punishment, yet the genius of ancient paganism had a gentler aspect. It is indeed difficult to tell what these inmates have to do here. Let us consider the case of the infants, and if we find it can only be cleared up by the general view of things here offered, this will be considered as another argument for the truth of our interpretation. Forthwith are heard voices, loud wailings, and weeping ghosts of infants in the first opening of the gate, whom bereaved of sweet life out of the course of nature, and snatched from the breast in a black unjoyous day, cut off and buried in an untimely grave. These appear to have been the cries and lamentings that Proclus tells us were heard in the mysteries, so that we only want to know the original of so extraordinary a circumstance, which I take to have been just such another provision of the lawgiver for the security of infancy, as that about funeral rites was for the adult. For nothing could more engage parents in the care and preservation of their young than so terrible a doctrine. Nor are we to imagine that their natural fondness needed no enforcement or support, for that most degenerate and horrid practice among the ancients of exposing infants was universal and had almost erased morality and instinct. We may well judge it to be so when we find it amongst the Chinese and the Arabians, the two peoples least corrupted by foreign manners and the vicious customs of more civilized nations, the Arabians particularly living much in a state of nature, where men's wants are few and consequently where there is small temptation to this unnatural crime, yet were become so prone to it that their lawgiver Mahomet found it necessary to exact an oath of the Arabian women not to destroy their children. The form of this oath is given to us by Garnier in his notes on Abul Fayda's Life of Mahomet, and it is in these words, "You will associate nothing with God, nor indulge anger, nor destroy your children, nor be disobedient to the apostle of God in that which is just." St. Paul seems to have had this in his eye when he accused the pagan world of being without natural affection. It needed therefore the strongest and severest check, and I am well persuaded it occasioned this counterplot of the magistrate in order to give instinct fair play and call back banished nature. Nothing indeed could be more worthy of his care, for the destruction of children, as Pericles finally observed of youth, is like cutting off the spring from the year. Accordingly, we are told by Diodorus that the Egyptians had a law against this unnatural practice, which law he numbers amongst the singularities of that people. They are obliged, says he, to bring up all their children in order to render the country populous, this being esteemed the best means of making states flourishing and happy. And Tacitus speaks of the prohibition as no less singular amongst the Jews. Here again, Mr. Bale is much scandalized. The first thing which occurred on the entrance into the other world was the station assigned to infants who cried and lamented without ceasing, and next to that, the station of men unjustly condemned to death. Now, what could be more shocking or scandalous than the punishment of those little creatures who had yet committed no sin, or those persons whose innocence had been oppressed by calumny? The first difficulty is already cleared up, the second shall be considered by and by. But it is no wonder Mr. Bale could not digest this doctrine of the infants, for I am much mistaken if it did not stick with Plato himself, who, relating the vision of Eros the Pamphylian concerning the distribution of rewards and punishments in another life, when he comes to the condition of infants, passes it over in these words: "But of children who died in their infancy, he reported certain other things not worthy to be remembered." Eras's account of what he saw in another world was a summary of what the Egyptians taught in their mysteries concerning that matter. And I make no doubt, but the thing not worthy to be remembered was the doctrine of infants in purgatory, which appears to have given Plato much scandal, who did not at that time at least reflect upon its original and use. But now, as to the falsely condemned, we must seek another solution. Next to those are such as had been condemned to death by false accusation. Nor yet were these seats assigned them without destination and appointment, or without the sentence of a judge. Minos, as inquisitor, shakes their urn. He convokes the council of the silent shades and examines their lives and crimes. This assignment appears both iniquitous and absurd. The falsely accused are not only in a place of punishment, but being first delivered under this single predicament, they are afterwards distinguished into two sorts, some as blamable, others as innocent. To clear up this confusion, it will be necessary to transcribe an old story told by Plato in his Gorgias. This law concerning mortals was enacted in the time of Saturn, and is yet and ever will be in force amongst the gods, that he who had lived a just and pious life should at his death be carried into the islands of the blessed and there possess all kinds of happiness, untainted with the evils of mortality. But that he who had lived unjustly and impiously should be thrust into a place of punishment, the prison of divine justice, called Tartarus. Now the judges with whom the execution of this law was entrusted were, in the time of Saturn and under the infancy of Jove's government, living men sitting in judgment on the living and passing sentence on them upon the day of their decease. This gave occasion to unjust judgments, on which account Pluto and those to whom the care of the happy islands was committed went to Jupiter and told him that men came to them wrongly judged, both when acquitted and when condemned. To which the father of the gods thus replied, I will put a stop to this evil. These wrong judgments are partly occasioned by the corporeal covering of the persons judged, for they are tried while living. Now many have their corrupt minds hid under a fair outside, adorned with birth and riches, and when they come to their trial, have witnesses at hand to testify for their good life and conversation. This perverts the process and blinds the eyes of justice. Besides, the judges themselves are encumbered with the same corporeal covering, and eyes and ears, and an impenetrable tegument of flesh, hinder the mind from a free exertion of its faculties. All these, as well their own covering, as the covering of those they judge, are bars and obstacles to right judgment. In the first place, then, says he, we are to provide that the foreknowledge which they now have of the day of death be taken away, and this shall be given in charge to Prometheus. And then provide that they who come to judgment be quite naked, for from henceforth they shall not be tried till they come into the other world. And as they are to be thus stripped, it is but fit their judges should await them there in the same condition, that, at the arrival of every inhabitant, soul may look on soul and all family relation, and every worldly ornament being dropped and left behind, righteous judgment may at length take place. I, therefore, who foresaw all these things before you felt them, have taken care to constitute my own sons the judges. Two of them, Minos and Rhadamanthus, are Asiatics. The third, Iacchus, a European. These, when they die, shall have their tribunal erected in the shades, just in that part of the highway where the two roads divide, the one leading to the Happy Islands, the other to Tartarus. Rhadamanthus shall judge the Asiatics, and Iacchus the Europeans. But to Minos I give the superior authority of hearing appeals when anything obscure or difficult shall perplex the other's judgments, that everyone may have his abode assigned him with the utmost equity. The matter now begins to clear up, and we see plainly that the circumstance of the falsely condemned alludes to this old fable, so that by falso damnati crinion mortis, if it be the true reading, Virgil did not mean, as one would suppose, men falsely condemned but wrongfully judged, whether to acquittal or conviction. But condemnation being oftenest the sentence of justice, the greater part is put figuratively for the whole. One difficulty remains, and that, to confess the truth, hath arisen rather from a mistake of Virgil than of his reader. We end these people yet unjudged, already exiled with other criminals in the assigned district of purgatory. But they are misplaced through an oversight of the poet, which, had he lived to perfect the Aeneid, he would probably have corrected. For the fable tells us they should be stationed on the borders of the three divisions, in that part of the high road that divides itself in two, which lead to Tartarus and Elysium, thus described by the poet. This is the place where the path divides in two. The right is that which leads to great Pluto's walls. By this our way to Elysium lies, but the left carries on the punishments of the wicked and conveys to cursed Tartarus. It only remains to consider the origin or moral of the fable, which I think was this. It was an Egyptian custom, as we are told by Diodorus Siculus, for judges to sit on every man's life at his interment. to examine his past actions and to condemn and acquit according to the evidence before them. These judges were of the priesthood, and so it is probable taught, like the priests of the Church of Rome, that their decrees were ratified in the other world. Partiality and corruption would, in time, pervert their sentence, and spite and favor prevail over justice. As this might scandalize the people, it would be found necessary to teach that the sentence which influenced everyone's final doom was reserved for a future judicature. However, the priest took care that all should not go out of his hands. And when he could be no longer judge, he contrived to find his account in turning evidence, as may be seen by the singular cast of this ancient inscription. I, Sextus Anicius Pontiff, certify that this man has lived honestly, may his soul rest in peace. Aeneas, having passed this first division, comes now on the confines of Tartarus, and is instructed in what relates to the crimes and punishments of the inhabitants. It is remarkable that Aeneas is led through the regions of Purgatory and Elysium, but he only sees the sights of Tartarus at a distance, and this could not be otherwise in the shows of the mysteries, for very obvious reasons. Among the criminals destined to eternal punishment in this division are those who had sinned so secretly as to escape the animadversion of the magistrate. And it was principally on account of such crimes that the legislator enforced the doctrine of a future state of punishment. The infringers of the duties of imperfect obligation which civil laws cannot reach, such as those without natural affection to brothers, duty to parents, protection to clients, or charity to the poor. So the law of the 12 tables, the invaders and violators of the holy mysteries, held out in the person of Theseus, make the last class of offenders. There sits, and to eternity shall sit, the unhappy Theseus, and Phlegyas, most wretched, is a monitor to all, and with loud voice proclaims through the shade, warned by my example, learn righteousness and not to contemn the gods. The fable says that Theseus and his friend Pirithous formed a design to steal Proserpine from hell. But being taken in the fact, Pirithous was thrown to the dog Cerberus, and Theseus kept in chains till he was delivered by Hercules, which without doubt means the death of one and the imprisonment of the other for their clandestine intrusion into the mysteries. We have already offered several reasons to show that the descent of Theseus into hell was a violation of the mysteries, to which we may add what the ancients tell us of the duration of his imprisonment, which was 4 years, the interim between the celebrations of the greater mysteries. But when Virgil comes to describe these shows, which were supposed to be a true representation of what was done and suffered in hell, Theseus is put among the damned, that being his station in the other world. This will remind the learned reader of a story told by Livy. The Athenians, says he, drew upon themselves a war with Philip on a very slight occasion, and at a time when nothing remained of their ancient fortune but their high spirit. 2 young Acarnanians, during the days of initiation, themselves uninitiated and ignorant of all that related to that secret worship, entered the temple of Ceres along with the crowd. Their discourse soon betrayed them as making some absurd inquiries into what they saw. So being brought before the president of the mysteries, although it was evident they had entered ignorantly and without design, they were put to death, as guilty of a most abominable crime. The office Theseus is put upon of admonishing his hearers against impiety could not sure be discharged in these shows by anyone so well as by him who represented the violator of them. But the critics, unconscious of any such design, considered the task the poet has imposed on Theseus of perpetually sounding in the ears of the damned this admonition, warned by my example, learn righteousness and not to contemn the gods, as a very impertinent employment. For though it was a sentence of great truth and dignity, it was preached to very little purpose amongst those to whom there was no room for pardon or remission. Even Scarron hath not neglected to urge this objection against it, and it must be owned that, according to the common ideas of Aeneas's descent into hell, the objection is not easily got over. But suppose Virgil to be here relating the admonitory maxima delivered during the celebration of these mystic shows, and nothing could be more just or useful, for then the discourse was addressed to the vast multitude of living spectators, nor is it a mere supposition that such discourses made part of these representations. Aristides expressly says that in no place were more astonishing words pronounced or sung than in these mysteries. The reason, he tells us, was that the sounds and the sights might mutually assist each other in making an impression on the minds of the initiated. But from a passage in Pindar, I conclude that in these shows, from whence men took their ideas of the infernal regions, it was customary for each offender as he passed by in machinery to make an admonition against his own crime. It is reported, says Pindar, that Ixion, by the decrees of the gods, while he is incessantly turning round his rapid wheel, calls out upon mortals to this effect, that they should be always at hand to repay a benefactor for the kindness he had done them. Where the word brotois, living men, seems plainly to show that the speech was at first made before men in this world. The poet closes his catalogue of the damned with these words, ausi omnes immane nefas, ausoque potiti. For the ancients thought that an action was sanctified by the success, which they esteemed a mark of the favor and approbation of heaven. As this was a very pernicious opinion, it was necessary to teach that the imperial villain who trampled on his country and the baited plotter who expired on a gibbet were equally the objects of divine vengeance. Aeneas has now passed through Tartarus, and here end the lesser mysteries. The hero advances to the borders of Elysium, and here he undergoes the lustration. Aeneas springs forward to the entry, sprinkles his body with fresh water, and fixes the bow in the fronting portal. Being now about to undergo the lustration, says Sopata, which immediately precedes initiation into the greater mysteries, they called me happy. Accordingly, Aeneas now enters on the greater mysteries and comes to the abodes of the blessed. They came at length to the regions of eternal joy, delightful green retreats and blessed abodes in groves where happiness abounds. Here the air they breathe is more free and enlarged, and clothes the fields with radiant light. Here the happy inhabitants know their own sun and their own stars. These two so different scenes explain what Aristides meant when he called the shows of the Eleusinian mysteries that most shocking and at the same time most ravishing representations. The initiated, who till now only bore the name of maistai, are called epoptai, and this new vision autopsia. The autopsia, or the seeing with their own eyes, says Psellus, is when he who is initiated beholds the divine lights. In these very circumstances, Themistius describes the initiated, when just entered upon this scene, it being thoroughly purified, he now discloses to the initiated a region all over illuminated and shining with a divine splendor. This which was all over illuminated and which the priest had thoroughly purified was a galma, an image. The reason of transferring what is said of the illumination of the image to the illumination of the region is because this image represented the appearances of the divine being in one large, uniform, extensive light. This, Iamblichus says, was without figure. To this image, the following lines in the oracles of Zoroaster allude, "Invoke not the self-conspicuous image of nature, for thou must not behold these things before thy body be purified by initiation." This autopton agalma was only a diffusive shining light, as the name partly declares, and the sight of this divine splendor was what the mysteries called autopsia. The cloud and thick darkness are dispersed, and the mind emerges as it were into day, full of light and cheerfulness, as before of disconsolate obscurity. Pletho tells us with what these clouds were accompanied, namely thunder and lightning and other meteoric appearances. He says they were symbols, but not of the nature of the deity. And this was true. For the symbol of that was the autopton agalma which followed. Hence, as we see above, it was without figure. Let me observe that the lines, "Here the air they breathe is more free and enlarged, and clothes the fields with radiant light. Here the happy inhabitants know their own sun and their own stars," are in the very language of those who profess to tell us what they saw at their initiation into the greater mysteries. "At midnight I saw the sun shining with a splendid light," says Apuleius on that occasion. Dupuy, speaking of the mysteries, says, "They discovered the origin of the soul, its fall to the earth through the spheres and the elements, and its return to the place of its origin. Here was the most metaphysical part, and which could not be understood by the generality of the initiated, but of which they gave them the sight by figures and allegorical spectres." See Moore's Epic. Thomas Taylor, a modern writer and I believe still living, in a dissertation on the Eleusinian and Bacchic mysteries, contends for the reality of the descent of the gods through magical evocation. And he quotes the authority of ancient authors in proof of the fact. Mr. Taylor possesses great erudition, has translated the commentaries of Proclus and the works of Iamblichus and Apuleius, is a thorough convert to the Platonic philosophy and an enthusiastic admirer of the rites of Ceres and Bacchus, in the composition of which, he says, we may discern the traces of exalted wisdom and sacerdotal theology, of a theology the most venerable for its antiquity and the most admirable for its excellence and reality. Plato, says he in the Phaedrus, thus describes the felicity of the virtuous soul prior to its descent, in a beautiful allusion to the arcane vision of the mysteries. But it was then lawful to survey the most splendid beauty when we obtained together with that blessed choir this happy vision and contemplation. And we indeed enjoyed this blessed spectacle together with Jupiter, but others in conjunction with some other god, at the same time being initiated in those mysteries which it is lawful to call the most blessed of all mysteries. And these divine orgies were celebrated by us, while we possessed the proper integrity of our nature, and were freed from the molestations of evil which awaited us in a succeeding period of time. Likewise, in consequence of this divine initiation, we became spectators of entire, simple, immovable, and blessed visions resident in a pure light, and were ourselves pure and immaculate and liberated from this surrounding vestment which we denominate body, and to which we are now bound like an oyster to its shell. Upon this beautiful passage, Proclus observes that initiation and inspection are symbols of ineffable silence and of union with mystical natures through intelligible visions. Now, from all this, it may be inferred that the most sublime part of epoptia or inspection consisted in beholding the gods themselves invested with a resplendent light, and that this was symbolical of those transporting visions which the virtuous soul will constantly enjoy in a future state, and of which it is able to gain some ravishing glimpses, even while connected with the cumbrous vestment of the body. But that this was actually the case is evident from the following unequivocal testimony of Proclus. In all initiations and mysteries, the gods exhibit many forms of themselves and appear in a variety of shapes, and sometimes indeed an unfigured light of themselves is held forth to the view. Sometimes this light is figured according to a human form, and sometimes it proceeds into a different shape. This doctrine, too, of divine appearances in the mysteries is clearly confirmed by Plotinus. And in short, that magical evocation formed a part of the sacerdotal office in the mysteries, and that this was universally believed by all antiquity long before the era of the latter Platonists, is plain from the testimony of Hippocrates, or at least Democritus, in his treatise De Morbo Sacro. For speaking of those who attempt to cure this disease by magic, he observes, if they profess themselves able to draw down the moon, to obscure the sun, to produce stormy and pleasant weather, as likewise showers of rain and heats, and to render the sea and the earth barren, and to accomplish everything else of this kind, whether they derive this knowledge from the mysteries or from some other institution or meditation, they appear to me to be impious from the study of such concerns. From all which it is easy to see how egregiously Dr. Warburton was mistaken, when in his divine legation he asserts that the light beheld in the mysteries was nothing more than an illuminated image which the priests had thoroughly purified. But he is likewise no less mistaken in transferring the injunction given in one of the magic oracles of Zoroaster to the business of the Eleusinian mysteries, and in perverting the meaning of the oracle's admonition. For thus the oracle speaks, invoke not the self-conspicuous image of nature, for you must not behold these things before your body has received the purification necessary to initiation. Upon which he observes that the self-conspicuous image was only a diffusive shining light, as the name partly declares. But this is a piece of gross ignorance, from which he might have been freed by an attentive perusal of Proclus on the Timaeus of Plato. For in these truly divine commentaries we learn that the moon is the self-luminous image of fontal nature. Theurgic magic is still adhered to by the Church of Rome and forms a part of the sacerdotal office, by which means it is believed that the real presence of the Savior is manifested in the Eucharist. Masonry adopts the same principle. In the Royal Arch degree, the autoptonagalma is exhibited in an illuminated bush. The candidate for initiation is ordered to put off his shoes, being told that the place where he stands is holy ground. In fact, one of the characters personates the deity and announces his actual appearance. The more we examine the pagan system of religion, the more shall we be convinced that the rites and ceremonies of Masonry, as well as those of the Catholic Church, are derived from that ancient institution. Virgil, by leaving his master and copying the amiable paintings of Elysium as they were represented in the Mysteries, hath artfully avoided a fault too justly objected to Homer, of giving so dark and joyless a landscape of the fortunate men, as could raise no desire or appetite for them. His favorite hero himself, who possessed them, telling Ulysses that he had rather be a day laborer above than command in the regions of the dead. Such a representation defeats the very intent of the lawgiver in propagating the doctrines of a future state. Nay, to mortify every excitement to noble actions, the Greek poet makes reputation, fame, and glory the great spur to virtue in the pagan system to be visionary and impertinent. On the contrary, Virgil, whose aim in this poem was the good of society, makes the love of glory so strong a passion in the other world that the Sibyls promised to Palinurus that his name should only be affixed to a promontory, rejoices his shade even in the regions of the unhappy. It was this ungracious description of Elysium and the licentious stories of the gods, both so pernicious to society, that made Plato banish Homer out of his Republic. But to return, the poet, having described the climate of the happy regions, speaks next of the amusement of its inhabitants. Some exercise their limbs on the grassy plains, in sports contend, and wrestle on the yellow sand. Besides the obvious allusion in these lines to the philosophy of Plato concerning the duration of the passions, it seems to have a more secret one to what he had all the way in his eye: the Eleusinian Mysteries, whose celebration was accompanied by the Grecian games. On which account too, perhaps, it was that, in the disposition of his work, his fifth book is employed in the games as a prelude to the descent in the sixth. The first place in these happy regions is assigned to the lawgivers and those who brought mankind from a state of nature into society. At the head of these is Orpheus, the most renowned of the European lawgivers, but better known under the character of poet, for the first laws being written in measure, to allure men to learn them, and when learnt, to retain them. The fable would have it that by the force of harmony, Orpheus softened the savage inhabitants of Thrace, but he has the first place because he was not only a legislator but the bringer of the mysteries into that part of Europe. The next is allotted to patriots and those who died for the service of their country. The third to virtuous and pious priests, for it was of principal use to society that religious men should lead holy lives, and that they should teach nothing of the gods but what was agreeable to the divine nature. The last place is given to the inventors of arts, mechanical and liberal. The order is exact and beautiful. The first class is of those who founded society, heroes and lawgivers. The second of those who supported it, patriots and holy priests, and the third of those who adorned it, the inventors of the arts of life and the recorders of worthy actions. Virgil has all along closely followed the doctrine of the mysteries, which carefully taught that virtue only could entitle men to happiness, and that rites, ceremonies, lustrations and sacrifices would not supply the want of it. Nor has he been less studious in copying their shows and representations, in which the figures of those heroes and heroines who were most celebrated in the writings of the ancient Greek authors passed in procession. But notwithstanding this entire conformity between the poet's scenes and those represented in the mysteries, something is still wanting to complete the identification, and that is the famous secret of the mysteries, the unity of the Godhead, of which so much hath been said above. Had Virgil neglected to give us this characteristic mark, though, even then, we could not but say his intention was to represent an initiation, yet we must have been forced to own he had not done it with the utmost art. But he was too good a painter to leave anything ambiguous, and hath therefore concluded his hero's initiation, as was the custom, with instructing him in the apereta, or the doctrine of the unity. Till this was done, the initiated was not arrived to the highest stage of perfection, nor in the fullest sense entitled to the appellation of epoptes. Musaeus, therefore, who had been Hierophant at Athens, takes the place of the Sibyl, as it was the custom to have different guides in different parts of the celebration, and is made to conduct him to the recess where his father's shade opens to him the hidden doctrine of perfection in these sublime words. First then, the divine spirit within sustains the heavens, the earth, and watery plains, the moon's enlightened orb and shining stars. And the eternal mind, diffused through all the parts of nature, actuates the whole stupendous frame and mingles with the vast body of the universe. Thence proceed the race of men and beasts, the vital principles of the flying kind, and the monsters which the ocean breeds under its smooth crystal plain. This was no other than the doctrine of the old Egyptians, as we are assured by Plato, who says they taught that Jupiter was the spirit which pervadeth all things. We have shown how easily the Greek philosophy corrupted this principle into what is now called Spinozism. Here Virgil has proved his judgment to great advantage. Nothing was more abhorrent from the mysteries than Spinozism, as it overturned the doctrine of a future state of rewards and punishments, which the mysteries so carefully inculcated. And yet the principle itself, of which Spinozism was the abuse, was cherished there, as it was the consequence of the doctrine of the unity, the grand secret of the mysteries. Virgil therefore delivereth the principle with great caution and pure and free of the abuse. Though he understood the nature of Spinozism, and in his fourth Georgic, where he delivereth it, appears to have been infected with it. The doctrine of the unity of the Godhead here contended by the author to be taught by Virgil, and as being the doctrine of the old Egyptians, must not be understood as opposed to the belief in the triplicity of the Supreme Being, an opinion universally held by the ancient world. Different nations expressed this triplicity by various names, to which they also assigned different attributes. The philosophers of all nations, says Ramsay in a dissertation on the theory and mythology of the pagans, seem to have had some idea, more or less confused, of the triplicity of the supreme unity. Plato speaks of the three forms of the divinity, which he calls agathos, logos, and psyche. The sovereign good, which is the principle of deity, the intelligence which drew the plan of the world, and the energy which executed it. An erroneous assignment is here made by Ramsay of the attributes or powers of the persons composing this trinity. Agathos, the sovereign good, is the intelligence which drew the plan of the world. Logos, or word, is the energy which executed it, and Psyche is but another name for Isis, indicating the productions of the earth, which gives a finish and beauty to the whole creation. This is agreeable to the Masonic Trinity, which is denominated wisdom, strength, and beauty. Fontenelle gives the following curious anecdote of a response from the oracle of Serapis. Thulis, a king of Egypt who, as is said, gave the name of Thule to the isle now called Iceland. His empire reaching thither was of large extent, and being puffed up with pride, he went to the oracle of Serapis, and thus spake to it, Thou that art the god of fire, and who governest the course of the heavens, tell me the truth. Was there ever, or will there ever be, one so puissant as myself? The oracle answered him thus, First God, then the Word and Spirit, all united in one, whose power can never end. Go hence immediately, O mortal, whose life is always uncertain. And Thulis, at his going thence, had his throat cut. The Greek inscription on the great obelisk at Rome, says Chateaubriand, was to this effect, The mighty God, begotten of God, and the all-resplendent Apollo, the Spirit. The idea of the pagan trinity, according to Volney's opinion, was founded on the three modes of action of the sun in the 3 seasons of the year. The sun thus characterized is, says he, no other than the three-eyed Jupiter, eye and sun being expressed by the same word in most of the ancient languages of Asia. This is the origin of all the trinitary systems, subtilized by Pythagoras and Plato, and totally disfigured by their interpreters. Although innovations appear to have been introduced in the administration of the rites of the lesser mysteries in Greece and Rome, particularly in the latter, still it does not appear that women, as our author supposes, were even admitted to participate in the celebrations of the greater mysteries, much less to act as hierophants to expound what were called the sacred secrets therein contained. This would have been too great a departure from the original, and moreover, exposed the secrets to too great hazard. In Egypt, the office of the priesthood is in every instance confined to the men. There are no priestesses in the service of male or female deities. And here it may be worthy of remark that the Freemasons have adhered closely to their prototype by the total exclusion of females from their order. Women and children, as we have seen, were freely admitted to the trifling shows and representations of the lesser mysteries. And here it seems, women sometimes took the lead and presided at the celebrations. Virgil has made this distinction as pointed as possible in the duties he assigns to the Sibyl. When she arrives in sight of Elysium, where the greater mysteries commence, her command ceases, and she resigns her office to Musaeus. She was an utter stranger to the country and applies to him for instruction. Aeneas, while under her guidance, could only view at a distance, like Moses upon Mount Pisgah, the happy realm of the blessed. The chief beheld their chariots from afar, their shining arms and coursers trained to war, their lances fixed in earth, their steeds around, free from their harness, graze the flowery ground. The love of horses which they had, alive, and care of chariots after death survive. Some cheerful souls were feasting on the plain. Some did the song and some the choir maintain, beneath a laurel shade where mighty Po mounts up to woods above and hides his head below. To these the Sibyl thus her speech addressed, and first to him surrounded by the rest, towering his height, and ample was his breast. Say, where lives Anchises, and where lies our way to find the hero for whose only sake we sought the dark abodes and crossed the bitter lake? To this the sacred poet thus replied, in no fixed place the happy souls reside. In groves we live and lie on mossy beds, by crystal streams that murmur through the meads. But pass you easy hills, and thence descend, the path conducts you to your journey's end. This said, he led them up the mountain's brow, and showed them all the shining fields below. They wound the hill, and through the blissful meadows go. The mysteries did not teach the doctrine of the unity for mere speculation, but, as we said before, to obviate certain mischiefs of polytheism, and to support the belief of a providence. Now, as a future state of rewards and punishments did not quite remove the objections to its inequalities here, they added to it the doctrine of the metempsychosis, or the belief of a prior state. And this, likewise, our poet has been careful to record. For after having revealed the great secret of the unity, he goes on to speak of the metempsychosis, or transmigration, in this manner. All these souls whom you see, after they have rolled away 1,000 years, are summoned forth by the god in a great body to the river Lethe, to the intent that, losing memory of the past, they may revise the upper regions and again become willing to return into bodies. And thence takes occasion to explain the nature and use of purgatory, which in his hero's passage through that region had not been done. This affords him too an opportunity for that noble episode, the procession of the hero's posterity, which passes in review before him, and with this the scene closes. In attending the hero's progress through the 3 estates of the dead, we have shown from some ancient author at almost every step the exact conformity of his adventures to those of the initiated in the mysteries. We shall now collect these scattered lights to a point, which will, I am persuaded, throw such a luster on this interpretation as to make the truth of it irresistible. To this purpose, I shall have nothing to do but to transcribe a passage from an ancient writer preserved by Stobaeus, which professes to explain the exact conformity between death or a real descent to the infernal regions, an initiation where the representation of those regions was exhibited. His words are these: the mind is affected and agitated in death, just as it is in initiation into the grand mysteries. And word answers to word as well as thing to thing, for Telsitan is to die, and teleistai to be initiated. The first stage is nothing but errors and uncertainties, laborious wanderings, a rude and fearful march through night and darkness. And now, arrived on the verge of death and initiation, everything wears a dreadful aspect. It is all horror, trembling and affrightment. But this scene once over, a miraculous and divine light displays itself, and shining plains and flowery meadows open on all hands before them. Here they are entertained with hymns and dances, with the sublime doctrines of sacred knowledge, and with reverend and holy visions. And now, become perfect and initiated, they are free and no longer under restraints, but crowned and triumphant, they walk up and down the regions of the blessed, converse with pure and holy men, and celebrate the sacred mysteries at pleasure. The son of Sirach, who was full of Grecian ideas, and hath embellished his admirable work of Ecclesiasticus with a great deal of Gentile learning, hath plainly alluded, though in few words, to these circumstances of initiation, where encouraging men to seek their wisdom, he says, "At first she will walk with him by crooked ways, and bring fear and dread upon him, and torment him with her discipline until she may trust his soul, and try him by her laws. Then will she return the straight way unto him, and comfort him, and show him her secrets." Chapter 4, 17-18. The conjecture of the author that an allusion is here made to circumstances attending initiations into the mysteries is corroborated, or, I might say, confirmed by Masonry, for a known practice in the one renders it pretty certain that the same existed in the other. In the Royal Arch degree, after the candidates have taken the required oath, they are told that they were now obligated and received as Royal Arch Masons. But as this degree was infinitely more important than any of the preceding, it was necessary for them, as before noticed, to pass through many trials and travel in rough and rugged ways to prove their fidelity, before they could be entrusted with the more important secrets of this degree. They are further told that though they could not discover the path they were to travel, they were under the direction of a faithful guide, who would bring the blind by a way they know not, and lead them in paths they had not known, who would make darkness light before them and crooked things straight, who would do these things and not forsake them. Isaiah 42, verse 16. Bernard. The progress finished and everything over, Aeneas and his guide are let out again to the upper regions through the ivory gate of dream, a circumstance borrowed from Homer and very happily applied to this subject. For as Euripides elegantly expresses it, a dream is the lesser mysteries of death, but besides this of ivory, there was another of horn. Through the first issued false visions, and through the latter true. Servius, with the spirit of a rank grammarian who seldom finds anything to stop at but a solecism in expression, says very readily, "Vult autem intelligi, falsa esse omnia quae dixit." He would have you understand by this that all he has been saying is false and groundless. Other critics give the same solution. Rumus, one of the best, may speak for them all. When therefore Virgil sends Aeneas forth through the ivory gate, he clearly indicates that whatever he has laid in regard to the infernal regions is to be reckoned among the fables. This interpretation is strengthened by Virgil's being an Epicurean and making the same conclusion in his second Georgic. Felix, qui potuit cognoscere causas, atque metus omnes, et inexorabile fatum, subgessit pedibus, strepitumque acherontis avari. Happy is he who can know the causes of things and tread underfoot all fear, inexorable fate, and the noise of greedy Acheron. But Virgil wrote not for the amusement of women and children over a winter's fire, in the taste of the Milesian fables, but for the use of men and citizens, to instruct them in the duties of humanity and society. The purpose, therefore, of such a writer when he treats of a future state must be to make the doctrine interesting to his reader and useful in civil life. Virgil hath done the first, by bringing his hero to it through the most perilous achievement, and the second, by appropriating the rewards and punishments of that state to virtue and to vice only. The truth is, the difficulty can never be gotten over but by supposing the descent to signify an initiation into the mysteries. This will unriddle the enigma and restore the poet to himself. And if this was Virgil's meaning, it is to be presumed he would give some private mark to ascertain it, for which no place was so proper as the conclusion. He has, therefore, with a beauty of invention peculiar to himself, made this fine improvement on Homer's story of the two gates, and imagining that of horn for true visions and that of ivory for false, insinuates by the first the reality of another state, and by the second the shadowy representations of it in the shows of the mysteries, so that not the things objected to Aeneas, but the scenes of them only were false, as they lay not in hell, but in the temple of Ceres. But though the visions which issued from the ivory gate were unsubstantial, as being only representative, yet I make no question but the ivory gate itself was real. It appears indeed to be no other than that sumptuous door of the temple through which the initiated came out when the celebration was over. This temple was of immense bigness. Ancient authors inform us that the festivals of Ceres sometimes brought to Eleusis 30,000 of the initiated, without including those who came only from motives of curiosity. These were not present at all the ceremonies. To the more secret, no doubt, were only admitted the small number of novices who every year received the last seal of initiation, and some of those who had received it long before. Behind the temple, on the western side, is still to be seen a terrace, cut in the rock itself, and raised 8 or 9 feet above the floor of the temple. Its length is about 270 feet, and its breadth in some places 44 feet. At the northern end is to be seen the remains of a chapel, to go up into which there were several steps. I conjecture that on this terrace was exhibited the scenery, that it was divided lengthwise into 3 great galleries, the first 2 of which represented the region of trial and that of the infernal shades, and the third, covered with earth, presented groves and meadows to the view of the initiated, who from thence went up into the chapel, where their eyes were dazzled by the splendor of the statue of the goddess. Travels of Anacasis. And now, having occasionally and by parts only said so much of these things, it will not be amiss in conclusion to give one general and concise idea of the whole. I suppose the substance of the celebration to be a kind of drama of the history of Ceres, which afforded opportunity to represent the 3 particulars about which the mysteries were principally concerned: the rise and establishment of civil society, the doctrine of a future state of rewards and punishments, the error of polytheism, and the principle of unity. But here let it be observed that the secrets of the mysteries were unfolded both by words and actions, of which Aristides, quoted above, gives the reason. That so the sounds and sights might mutually assist each other in making an impression on the minds of the initiated. The error of polytheism, therefore, was as well exposed by the dark wanderings in the subterraneous passages through which the initiated began his course, as by the information given him by the Hierophant, and the truth of the unity as strongly illustrated by the orthoptonagalma, the self-seen image, the diffusive shining light, as by the hymn of Orpheus or the speech of Anchises. On the whole, if I be not greatly deceived, the view in which I place this famous episode not only clears up a number of difficulties inexplicable on any other scheme, but likewise ennobles and gives a graceful finishing to the whole poem. For now, the episode is seen to be an essential part of the main subject, which is the erection of a civil polity and a religion. For custom had made initiation into the mysteries a necessary preparative to that arduous undertaking. To conclude, the principles here assumed in explaining this famous poetical fiction are, I presume, such as give solidity as well as light to what is deduced from them, and are perhaps the only principles from which anything reasonable can be deduced in a piece of criticism of this nature. For from what I have shown was taught and represented in the mysteries, I infer that Aeneas's descent into hell signifies an initiation, because of the exact conformity in all circumstances between what Virgil relates of his hero's adventure and what antiquity delivers concerning the shows and doctrines of those mysteries into which heroes were wont to be initiated. The view taken by Bishop Warburton of the purport of the 6th book of the Aeneid was new and calculated to excite the deep attention of the learned world. Accordingly, various opinions were entertained for and against the correctness of the position assumed by him. Among the critics who entered the lists in opposition to the author was the celebrated historian Gibbon, and this, he says, was his first publication in English. His remarks on the subject are contained in the 3rd volume of his miscellaneous work, which he introduces as follows. The allegorical interpretation which the Bishop of Gloucester has given of the 6th book of the Aeneid seems to have been very favorably received by the public. Many writers, both at home and abroad, have mentioned it with approbation, or at least with esteem, and I have more than once heard it alleged in the conversation of scholars as an ingenious improvement on the plain and obvious sense of Virgil. As such, it is not undeserving the notice of a candid critic, nor can the inquiry be void of entertainment, whilst Virgil is our constant theme. I shall readily allow what I believe may in general be true, that the mysteries exhibited a theatrical representation of all that was believed or imagined of the lower world, that the aspirant was conducted through the mimic scenes of Erebus, Tartarus, and Elysium, and that a warm enthusiast, in describing these awful scenes, might express himself as if he had actually visited the infernal regions. It is not surprising that the copy was like the original, but it still remains undetermined whether Virgil intended to describe the original or the copy. If the copy was a true representation of the original, of what consequence is it which the poet took as his sampler? But as it was more easy to procure a connected inscription of the spectacles exhibited in the temple of the Eleusinian series than of what takes place in the regions below, it is most probable Virgil chose the former. Besides, it may be remarked that the description of the infernal regions was doubtless first matured in the mysteries. No author, it is presumed, had before their establishment ever given anything like a detailed account of such place. They therefore, properly speaking, are the original, and the parallel is to be found in Virgil's description of Aeneas's descent. Mr. Voltaire showed great fickleness in his opinion on this subject, sometimes giving it in favor of Warburton's hypothesis, and at others the contrary. Speaking of the Eleusinian Mysteries, volume 16, page 162, he says, "The mysterious ceremonies of Ceres were an imitation of those of Isis. Those who had committed crimes confessed and expiated them. They fasted, they purified themselves, and gave alms. All the ceremonies were held secret under the religious sanction of an oath to render them more venerable. The mysteries were celebrated in the night to inspire a holy horror. They represented a kind of tragedy in which the spectacle exposed to view the happiness of the just and the torments of the wicked. The greatest men of antiquity, the Platos, the Ciceros, have eulogized these mysteries, which had not then degenerated from their primitive purity. Very learned men have supposed that the sixth book of the Aeneid was a description of what passed in these solemn and celebrated shows." Again he says, "The sixth book of the Aeneid is only a description of the mysteries of Isis and the Eleusinian series." He afterwards recants this opinion and says, "I think I see a description of the Eleusinian series in Claudian's poem on the river of Proserpine, much clearer than I can see any in the sixth book of the Aeneid. Virgil lived under a prince who joined to all his other bad qualities that of wishing to pass for a religious character, who was probably initiated in these mysteries himself, the better thereby to impose upon the people, and who would not have tolerated what would have been pretended to be such decided profanation. Why, Augustus was the hero of the poem. It was for his honor and glory that the poet labored. He was, says our author, shadowed in the person of Aeneas, and would not, therefore, probably have been very scrupulous about a vague exposition of the mysteries while it tended to his own glorification. Claudian, says Warburton, professes openly to treat of the Eleusinian mysteries at a time when they were in little veneration. It is not strange, therefore, that Mr. Voltaire should see a description of the Eleusinian series in Claudian's poem much clearer than in the sixth book of the Aeneid, the author of which evidently not intending that his object should be generally known. Voltaire seems frequently to have written offhand, without subjecting himself to the trouble of rigid scrutiny. And indeed, he wrote so much and upon such a variety of topics that it would appear impossible that he should bestow strict attention to them all. In the present case, his first impressions appear to have been founded on the opinions of the learned men he alludes to, and he probably adopted a contrary belief in like manner without an attentive examination of the subject. Bishop Warburton was probably occupied many years in the composition of his learned work. He had thoroughly studied the subject, and it is confidently believed that this application of the sixth book of the Aeneid to the mysteries will stand the test of the most severe criticism. The Abbé Barthélemy, in an article on the mysteries in his Travels of Anacharsis, quotes the Aeneid in a description of them, as if no question then existed in regard to Virgil's views. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment, and if you can please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.